Hey everyone, wow, that's an echo. My name is Andrew Hong. Nice to see all these friendly faces here, and it's weird not talking to a camera for once. But yeah, I've been in the crypto space for a few years, mostly doing data across places like Consensus, Mirror, currently just freelancing around. And I really want to talk to you today about how you can leverage your data community, specifically if you're like a protocol or team that has just launched something and you're trying to go from 0 to 1. The right way is not just sending out 3 tweets saying there's a bounty and hoping that people will come and help you with your analytics. It's a good way to have either bad dashboards or no dashboards. So I know we're all kind of tired, but this should be a pretty lightweight, fun conversation. So I'm going to cover 3 things specifically here. Number 1 is understanding Web3 analytics pipelines. Hopefully by now you kind of understand how Dune tables work. If not, I'll still walk through that pretty quickly. Second is collaborating with Dune wizards or data wizards. There's a lot of types of wizards, and it's helpful to kind of know who to reach out to for what. And third is going to be how to make wizard lives easier. There's a lot of protocols that don't do a good job of thinking about data analysis when they're deploying protocols, and they miss events or have empty events or worse. That'll be a fun section where I just talk about do's and don'ts. So let's get into it. So Web3 analytics pipelines. I'm sure some of you have seen, I don't have a thing here. I'm sure some of you have seen this diagram, right? This is the Web2 modern data stack. It's a combination of event streaming, storing a bunch of CSV files and kind of random databases into a warehouse. And then you have some teams that hopefully make that data cleaner so that you can make your cool machine learning models and cool dashboards and whatnot. Web3, it kind of still uses the same tech underneath, but because we all use this standardized data set, we're all contributing to the same pipeline at once, right? So step 1 of that is Dune-based tables. Again, hopefully you all know this by now, but there's main tables for knowing all blocks that are mined, who's mining those blocks, when they were mined. There's contract deployments. There's event logs. Again, events are emitted whenever someone executes a transaction, like swapping on Uniswap. There's internal transactions, which is when a contract calls another contract. That data is also stored. And then there's transaction data, which is just the first level of data that you see on Etherscan whenever you've submitted a transaction. And if you've never submitted a transaction and you're trying to get into Web3, please submit a transaction first so you kind of know what you're playing with. All of these are mainly connected by transaction hash, as well as other columns, but that's the main one you can think of as in terms of like, oh, how are these tables even related? And with the V2 engine, you can query across almost every EVM chain that's relevant right now, and Solana. So that's powerful, and I don't know of any other engine that lets you do that. Decoded tables, these are tables that are kind of built off of the contracts that have been submitted. Anyone can submit a contract from Etherscan, like just take the address, plug it into the decoder in your Dune profile, and the tables will populate in about a day or so. It's not magic. It's actually fairly simple. And then you can query the table just like this. It's just the name of the protocol and then the event or function that you're trying to look into, right? So these all exist as different tables. And hopefully for anyone who attended Megan's session earlier on Spellbook, then you should know that we have these aggregated tables as well that have all NFT trades or all DEX trades across chains. And those are built up by combining various parts of decoded tables and base tables in magical ways so that we can have higher fidelity aggregated data to query off of, and that makes wizard lives easier, right? Yeah, you have labels, prices, who's holding what ERC20 or ERC721 tokens, and more. Anyone with a GitHub account can add to Spellbook. There's no kind of gatekeeping to any of this, so don't be afraid to contribute. We're all fairly nice. So that gets us back to that first diagram I was showing earlier. What's the Web3 analytics pipeline look like, right? So you have ingestions, you have bronze, silver, and gold tables, and then you have outputs, which are either API queries, ad hoc analysis, dashboards, or research and models. What's really important to note here is that this gets more and more manual and more specialized as you go left to right, and there are less wizards kind of within each specific level here and within protocol types, which is, I think, why Web3 analytics takes a lot longer to kind of mature in some sense, because we all have to be like, oh, there's this cool new protocol that came out. There has to be at least one or two people that understand it, and then those two people have to convince the maintainers, basically, that this is the right way to add to these gold tables before it gets the output. So it's not some super simple stuff where it's like, oh, it's decoded, it should just be into the gold standard within a day, right? So hopefully that all makes sense. That's just level settings, so you kind of know what's the pipeline we're working with here. Next, I'm going to cover what kinds of wizards there are and how you can try to engage and collaborate with them. So for types of wizards, let's start with data analysts. I think you typically have like Etherscan navigators, people who kind of know how to filter events, how to filter functions. They should be fairly familiar with Etherscan in general. I like to think of this category more as like business development, business analysts who kind of have an understanding of the protocol. They're kind of going about their day-to-day, and they just need to check things on chain once in a while. The next level above that is you have wizards, which is kind of the term we're most familiar with. They know how to work with more complex contract patterns. They should know the difference between like L1, L2 chains. They're probably SQL experts at some level. And then we get into data engineering. So RPC raters, these are people who know how to work with JSON, RPC clients from different types of clients. They can work with mempool data, and they know how to kind of organize all of this data into a nice data engineering pipeline. Now you have Arch wizards, who are the ones who are contributing to the spellbook. They typically, on top of knowing how to manage complex data transformations, they typically have some sort of like protocol expertise within either like NFTs, DAOs, or DeFi. So you can basically ask them about like any protocol in their domain, and they'll basically be able to be like, oh yeah, I know that they're doing X, Y, Z. They're probably upgrading to this. This is how they're compared. And this is why like the data looks different between like LooksRare and OpenSea, or why they look exactly the same. Third one, this is kind of the most rare right now, I would say, is like the data science category. I think you have token engineers, which are people who are on the protocol team, and they not only understand the protocol well, but they also understand how to think about, okay, if the protocol does X, Y, Z, how do I use token incentives or token mechanisms to kind of tie into that? Whereas sorcerers are the ones who are kind of more external, but they're helping out with various proposals in the DAO to say, hey, you might not be looking at this, but here's a reason why like your market share has decreased in like the last 2 months or so. I think a good example of this is like Alex Kruger helped out a lot on like the Uniswap proposals, I think last December or so. So you might have noticed a trend. The first level here is really usually internal, and like the teams have these on their team. And then the second level here is more external community. The skill sets are different, which is kind of like the main thing I want to highlight, because I think a lot of teams expect like, oh, the wizards or arch wizards or sorcerers should be doing the internal job, or like the people they have internally, like a business analyst, should just be able to do everything that the wizard does. And it's like, not exactly, right? But they have to work together. Right, so how do they work together? So in my opinion, this is how I think the wizards, both internally and externally, work together along the pipeline, right? So for analytics engineering, you're mainly going to be relying on arch wizards for like the gold level aggregations in Spellbook, and then you can probably rely on like a normal wizard for like the silver level, just like, hey, my protocol doesn't have the best event structure. I need a basic aggregation for like getting user balances every day. Can you help me with that? Oops. The rest of this, I won't go into it too much. I hope it's fairly obvious why certain wizard types are in different areas, but this kind of gives you a framework to think about it, like, oh, if I need dashboards, who do I go to? If I need like research, who do I go to, right? And hopefully one day we have like a catalog of like who fits into one structure, right? Because right now it's like mostly living in our heads, I would say, especially in the Dune community, of like, okay, which wizards know what are their expertises, what part of the pipeline do they focus on, who's out there doing the most competitions and whatnot. Reward systems. I think there's two categories of reward systems, right? One is one time, and these are either open bounties, which are like competitions that we see hosted more and more on layer 3 XYZ. Or you have private bounties, which are basically connecting with the wizard one-on-one, so you can have more back and forth for more advanced requests. And I normally don't do either of these two. The ones that I usually go for are the continuous ones. So these are ones that either have like retroactive grant committees. So a team like NounsDAO, for example, or Lil Nouns is like, someone has a new protocol or like really cool project out there. I think it's really cool, and I want to go analyze it, and I don't want to go through a grant process. I will kind of go, well, I don't want to go through like a bounty back and forth process. I'll basically go and check like, oh, does this group have a history of retroactively giving grants and rewarding contributors? And if they don't, I'll be like, okay, that's a red flag. I might not want to contribute to them. But if they do, I'm like almost 10 times more likely to take the extra step. Be like, okay, I'll do a contribution because I know I'll probably get something, even if it takes 2-3 months for it to go through the grant committee. So that's retroactive grants. And then recurring bounties, I think, are something we'll see more and more for upkeep, especially as protocols get more complex. Because I think most of the protocols that we've seen today are like, oh, you deploy once, there aren't that many extra parameters to like change on it or to upgrade on it. It's like whatever you deploy day one is what it's going to be like for the end of time. Versus like a lot of the protocols we're seeing today, like SudoSwap, for example, is like they deploy with a ton of features. Half of them aren't live. They leave like room for basically adding more and more functionality. So I think we're going to see more like recurring bounties where it's like, hey, there's like a monthly bounty pool that gets delegated to a bunch of contributors, and like that, we know that's going to get refilled, if that makes sense, right? So again, I've kind of tried placing these along the pipeline as well. So you kind of have an idea of like, oh, if I'm looking really quickly at like ad hoc analysis, it's probably better to have like a competition if you have like an open question, or if you just leave a question board open and just wait for people to answer it. That's probably most efficient in terms of like how wizards work. Now, this is the part I think I've been having more fun with in testing, is engaging wizards along the analytics pipeline. So again, my background is much more focused in education and like how do you get communities more engaged along things, more so than, like I think a lot of the wizards here have contributed more than me when it comes to like creating dashboards or stuff in Spellbook. So I think typically we have protocols go from releases to documentation to research, and then they try to just basically go in that tight cycle slowly. But I think we can basically make things more efficient by adding steps in between, right? So if you just released a new protocol, it's not a good idea to just be like, hey, this protocol is out there a week ago. Here's a competition. Have at it. The competition ends in a month. And like, no one understands your protocol. The documentation around it is probably not trash, minimal. And like, no, there's like not enough activity to even ask good questions, right? So I think like a good engagement cycle is like your protocol is just released. Go have someone do like education about it and kind of go through it, explain things from like a data analyst perspective, so that one, you have better documentation to work with, and two, it's like, oh, as someone like normally as I go through like the education process, I'll contribute to Spellbook to be like, okay, I kind of have a better understanding of the protocol. I can make some either user-generated views or like highly aggregated like NFT trade views to kind of make things easier so that now when you do like what I like to call a scavenger hunt versus a competition, when you do a scavenger hunt, people have stuff to work off of, right? They can immediately be like, hey, oh, I can learn about this protocol through this video, or oh, this documentation isn't just like this function does this and this function does that. It's like, oh, here's how the data is tied, you know, and they have Spellbook tables to kind of work off of. That's, at the very least, you're going to get more bang for your buck that way. I think then that's a good way to get more niche dashboards instead of everyone just doing TVL. And that means you'll have better questions and insights that you can then go and do focused research on through like DAO proposals, rather than like waiting for your TVL to drop and then being like, we need to research what's going on here. Do we add fees or do we pump the token? You know, I think there's like a lot more testing that can be done there in that cycle. I'm personally focused on the orange parts there. If any protocol teams out there need help, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to try and figure something out there for us. My contact's at the end, I think. Okay, that was a lot. We can come back to that later, but this will be more the fun section. How to make wizards' lives easier, because wizards' lives are not very easy right now. It's like basically being a second citizen in the crypto world. Everyone's just like, oh, cool dashboards. And it's like, well, like I cried while reading someone's Solidity one time. So especially right when you launch. So making well-defined events. I'm not going to even go into functions because like I get that functions you have other considerations to make in terms of like what variables you return and take in. But at the very least, when you're doing events, please don't emit empty events, right? Again, for all the protocols that I do cover in this, I love you, and it's fine, but like don't do this again. I feel like a parent, but I think when I see an empty event, it's like, what is the phrase? Like every time there's an empty event, a baby somewhere dies, is kind of how I think of it. And you should think of it with that seriousness as well. I think like I've seen this happen a few times, and I asked the protocol developers, and they're like, oh, but emitting events has like a tiny bit of gas. And I'm like, look, that's like 2 cents you might be saving per transaction on the protocol level, but that's like permanent extra compute cost and like analyst tiers that you're costing over time. So please, like for swaps, for examples, you should have any prices or rates, any tokens, and any starting and any balances should be emitted, especially if you have any sort of complex calculations. Just emit them. There's no reason for you not to. Like there's literally no reason. Second, if you use events for more than one type of action or function, it should be easy to attribute where that came from. Again, this is pseudo-swap. They have spot price update, which is like every time there's a swap, the price updates based on like whatever the price of the pool is. But within those contracts, the owner of the pool can also change the price at any time, right? So if I'm only looking at events, I don't know if a price changed because the owner changed it or if because like someone actually swapped a token at that price, right? And like again, that makes things really confusing to read through, and that's extra logic that we now have to consider from like the data pipeline perspective. Like you could either do this as different events or just add a second variable that says like owner changed or swapped. Like it's not it's not that hard. Cool. Having event coverage and adherence to standards. We have hopefully. Does everyone here know what Open Zeppelin is? Kind of? Okay, so Open Zeppelin, they've done a ton of token standards in terms of ERC20s, ERC721s, ERC1155s, and a few others. Though 2020, in this year of 2022, we still have people creating their own ERC20 implementations, which is fine. Like, if you want to be fancy with it, I get it. There's one team that's famous for this, and that's Compound, their original ERC20 token that did delegation, which is cool. But their newest one, they have essentially a transfer event where no transfer, or like they have a transfer function where no transfer event is emitted. And when I talked to them about it, they were like, oh, but if you call balance of, the balance is correct. And I'm like, well, yes, but like even on Etherscan, it's not showing the tokens are transferred. You know, it's like if every protocol did this and we had to think about custom ways of constructing transfer events, like the data would not flow anymore, you know? Like, anyways, so at the very least, if you're playing with a token standard that's out there, please make sure you have good event coverage, at least on the transfer events, because I think like we're only gonna get more and more complex tokens out there. So like best case is you just inherit ERC20, like best case. But if you have to do custom, have good coverage. All right. Basic documentation starts from NatSpec. NatSpec is, well, it's in the next example because this one doesn't have NatSpec. But it's basically the documentation you have on top of functions and events that tells you what that function event does, what each of the variables are. Right. On the left here, we have the infamous maker contracts where the functions and the variables make no sense. Like, does anyone have a guess of what function kick does? It's a liquidation function for your maker vaults. And their function naming is unclear, and they have no documentation about what that function does. Thankfully, we haven't seen something this atrocious recently. But a great example of someone doing things well is Uniswap. I think has consistently had the best NAT spec and documentation, both on the contract and off the contract. So like, big kudos to them for making our lives easier in general. Everyone should have this. Ideally, you have this in an interface. So for people who don't know like Solidity contract patterns that well, right now people like to define like all the functions and events that are like key to a contract in this like interface, which basically has no logic. It's just defining the functions, and then you inherit them in the main contract, which has like much longer logic. So like the interface is like a summary. So you should put the description about what your functions events do in the summary. It's just intuitive. But again, Uniswap does a great job of that, and I think like a lot of protocols do a good job of that. But that would be nice. This one's like a heavier ask. I think a lot of protocols, when they do documentation, they think of things as like, oh, if I define all the functions and if I define all the events, people will figure it out, you know. But like one of the hard parts about being a data analyst is like figuring out like, okay, there's some user state, like how much they've borrowed, that we want to track, and like I have no idea which functions are going to change that state or which events help me track that changing of states. And I'd say like one of the most time-consuming things for me as an analyst is just basically taking each variable that I want to represent and figuring out like, oh, this function will change it this way, this function will change it this way. There might be an edge case here where like the math doesn't check out, or like the math has like an overflow, so they cut it off, so that doesn't actually happen, even though the function was called and it continues to run. So stuff like that is helpful. I like to think of terms of like, you have contract patterns, and then you have like the liquidity or ownership management under those patterns, and then how that ties into like the token and user states. So you can kind of think of it as like a tree flow of like, if you're explaining some function, you should talk about like the contract patterns from how it affects overall liquidity and how it affects token user states. Because for some protocols, like Aave v3, for example, the storage contracts are like kind of spread out, and they're like fairly hard to start tracking down, like, oh, the user state is here, the pool state's over here. There's indexes that are like kind of tied across structs. And it's not helpful to just be like, borrow, mints AUSDC if you put USDC in. You know, it's like that. That doesn't give me the full picture. I tried doing some documentation around this for like pseudoswap, for example, where it's like, there's some main interaction. There's the functions and events that are like tied to it. And then there's like traces and transactions, which we can use to kind of proxy data that's missing. There's definitely better and more creative ways to represent this than a grid, but you know, we start somewhere. And I get that this also takes extra time. So this kind of goes into like the protocol education thing, where it's like, you've deployed something, you need help, just reach out to a wizard or me. And like, I will literally help you do this so that we can make everyone else's lives easier. So, oh, last big thing here is there should be some way to access the BD team or the developers to ask clarifying questions. If I have to ask in the general help section of a Discord right after you've released, along with everyone else asking like, the UI's not working, when token, like, we're not gonna get very far. So, last one. Fifth thing. I think this is like another nice to have, and I think most protocols do a good job of this. Is contract deployments are not always very straightforward, especially for like initialization of anything in DeFi. Compound Comet did do a good job of basically saying, hey, there's 7 transactions that were executed at deployment. Here's what each of those transactions do. Here's links to like the discussion around how the thought process behind each function call was decided upon. Like risk parameters, for example, like how much of each token to have as like a supply cap. Like they nicely link to the discussion around that alongside the proposal for deploying the contract. And like that's really nice, because otherwise I'm kind of sitting there not knowing like, oh, if I'm just looking on Etherscan, I just see a bunch of numbers. I don't know why those numbers exist, and it's easy for me to miss something. And again, going back to like protocols in the last few years, that were deployed were simple, and the protocols being deployed now are just going to get more and more complex. It should be easy to figure out what features are live at both like a protocol and front-end level, so that I can know like, oh, okay, like these extra 5 contracts here, I don't have to worry about until like maybe 2 months out. Rather than, again, like being a data analyst is a lot of thinking about edge cases. Like if something's not live and you can tell me that up front, that saves me a lot of mental space. So that was a lot. I don't know if I lost everyone or if I've kept some people, but this was a guide on how to take your protocol team's relationship with the data community from 0 to 1. Like that's just 0 to 1. I think like a lot of the stuff you saw today from like Uniswap and Lido and whatnot, like they're already going like 1 to 100. And like you can't think of things as like, oh, I want that. I'm gonna go hire a wizard to do all of that. It's like, no, you have to take the 0 to 1 step of like understanding how these engagement loops work, of making wizards' lives easier, of understanding what kind of wizards to reach out to, and like how it all contributes and comes back to like the Web3 data analytics pipeline to kind of get your team to that level. So that's all. Oh yeah, reach out to me at Andrew Hong 5297 on Twitter, Telegram, or Gmail for any inquiries or partnerships. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Any questions? Well, that was really nice. Oh.
What was the worst protocol you've had to work with the data with?
What was the worst protocol? Are we still live streaming?
No, we're offline. I took the stream offline.
Let's see. I'm trying to remember.
And why was it pseudo-swap?
Pseudoswap was painful, but like the contract complexity of pseudoswap wasn't too bad, so it made it okay. Like there was only one function we had to kind of work around. I would say like worst one. I think a lot of the newer DeFi protocols just have very confusing storage layouts in general, but that's more of like a me thing.
Probably also like just like increasing complexity in the systems, right?
Yeah, and it's like with increasing complexity, we kind of need easier ways to track events. Like basically anything that has complex user states. It's like Aave v3, for example, I spent like 2 weeks going through, and their like storage levels are so deep that like, because basically Aave v3 is like, you used to just have like 9 tokens, and then you can supply collateral and borrow, and it's all tied. But now V3 allows you to kind of group tokens together. And like they were very unclear about like what groupings were already live. Like their white paper was like, you can have stable coins, you can have like more risky assets. And I went to see what's live, and it was like there were 2 stable coin pools alive, and I was like, which one's live, which one's not? And it's like I asked around, it was like crickets. So that's an example of like complex protocol. Documentation was like very basic, no access to devs for like questions and answers. So then I was like, all right. And they had no bounty open. So I was like, all right, moving on. But again, that's like more of like if I understood like the protocol better from like a Solidity side, maybe it would have been easier.
Okay. Shall we make like an open letter to developers?
Oh yeah.
This is kind of like an open letter to like
this is kind of an open letter for the data
developers.
community. I think one day we're gonna have data audits and data scorecards where it's like, let's say that we have a really good bounty system. If you want to even be able to submit protocols to that system, you have to have had like one wizard or one auditor sign off. Otherwise, you can't even access our bounty system. Like, I think that's where we're gonna end up at some point. Because it's literally like before you hit deploy, go and ask one wizard to like go and take a look, and like we'll give you feedback. It's saving us time. Like
saving everyone time, and
yeah.
In the end, like it makes your protocol more approachable for everyone. If it's like I can go in Etherscan, and like even my, what did you call them, Etherscan explorers?
Yeah.
Like even they can just like read what happened.
Yeah.
It's like if I go in, like if I swap in pseudo swap, and it's just like, yeah, like I've done a swap, like thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.
what the hell?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Oh,
I totally feel your pain, man. It's and this is a problem I think in Web 2 world as well. And I can only imagine like being in Web 3 where everything's decentralized, it just magnifies. My question is what's the incentives the developers have to properly instrument events? Do they have like any incentive on their end?
Yeah, I think there's like two ways to think about it. One is for like, especially for like NFT protocols that are like more, well, depends on what your thesis is on aggregators versus marketplaces. But like for aggregators and whatnot, like that's a lot of data engineering that they're gonna have to do. So if you want easier integrations and better integrations into aggregators in general, that's one reason to make the data easier to track. I also think like UI and UX in crypto is, we've been saying this for years, but it should be improving soon. Hopefully the Dune API will help to change that. And I think it'll be obvious when some protocols have like really good data in like their in their user interfaces and those that don't. Like I think it's going to become increasingly obvious, especially as like, oh, your protocol was like so bad we couldn't even figure out a way to get into DEX trades. Like now you don't even show up in like people's comparisons of like an industry, you know? So I think like the incentives are going to be there one day. I sure hope so. I don't know. There's probably people probably have better ideas than me here about what else might drive that.